coming from. Thank you so much for registering for our webinar, Cultivating Courage. My name is Umayma Mohammed. I'll be moderating our panel today, and I'm a Palestinian MD PhD student, currently in the middle of my graduate training in sociology. I'm also an organizer who has been in the Palestine liberation movement for over a decade, and I've also spent many years resisting anti-Muslim racism and structures of policing and surveillance. I feel so honored to be moderating a panel with some of the most brilliant, compassionate, and courageous voices in healthcare right now, speaking against the genocide in Gaza, and also here to help us launch a new project called Cultivating Courage. Before I give an introduction to Cultivating Courage, I want to briefly introduce our incredible panelists. So first is Dr. Nadal Jabur, who is a Palestinian American physician specializing in internal and geriatric medicine, and he is also the founding president of Doctors Against Genocide. He is dedicated to restoring the true moral obligation of medicine to protect the weak and the vulnerable, advocating for the sanctity of life and justice in the face of mass atrocities. Next, we have Dr. Asfiya Qaadir, who is a board-certified adult and child adolescent psychiatrist practicing in Minnesota. She's currently serving as the DEI clinical consultant to Prairie Care Newport, one of the largest providers of mental health services for youth in the entire United States. She is also currently banned from representing Prairie Care in any public speaking and censored internally for conducting clinical training on the mental health of Palestinian children and families. Next on our panel is Dr. Rupa Marya, who is a physician, activist, writer, mother, and a composer. She's a professor of medicine at UCSF and a co-founder of the Do No Harm Coalition. Her work sits at the nexus of climate health and racial justice, and she has also co-authored with Raj Patel the book Inflamed: Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Injustice. Next, we have Dr. Yapeng Ji, who's a primary care physician and public health practitioner based on the traditional, unceded, and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. In his clinical practice, he works in family medicine and refugee health at a community center. He's worked on and studied the structural and colonial determinants of health in both the settler colonial context of so-called Canada and occupied Palestine. Dr. Gabor Mate is a retired physician who, after 20 years of family practice and palliative care, worked for over a decade in Vancouver's downtown East Side with patients challenged by drug addiction and mental illness. He is the best-selling author of 5 books and is an internationally renowned speaker for his expertise on addiction, trauma, childhood development, and the relationship of stress and illness. And lastly, we have Morgan Chalmier, who is an MD PhD candidate in medical anthropology, whose work uses the frameworks of critical refugee studies and reproductive justice to examine systems of humanitarian care for displaced populations. What an honor it is to have this incredible panel. Before I move to our panelists, I wanted to start off a little bit by talking about what this webinar is for. So we organized this webinar as an introduction to Cultivating Courage, which is a peer-to-peer curriculum that will encourage healthcare workers and students to build the collective power they need to do 3 things. The first is to speak up against the genocide in Gaza. The second is to establish healthcare for all. And the third is to build a just future for our health systems. So a collective of healthcare workers and students, many of us who are on this panel, have been working for months to build this project because we saw 2 important gaps we felt needed to be filled in the movement in regards to healthcare workers and students. So the first gap we identified is that many healthcare workers are still not in this movement to end the genocide in Gaza, which is so shocking considering when one of Israel's main targets in the last 15 months of this genocide have been healthcare institutions and healthcare workers. These are our colleagues who share our oaths to protect life. These are our places of healing in which care should be the highest principle. And yet the majority of healthcare workers globally, but particularly in the West, have been silent. I've been thinking a lot about particularly why Israel targets healthcare workers. And beyond just the obvious reason that it cuts off Gaza's lifelines, I want folks to leave with the understanding that Israel is truly more afraid of the healthcare workers in Gaza than the resistance fighters because of these healthcare workers' ability to teach life to the world, to teach care, and to teach courage, and to teach what it means to be a provider who fights for life like it is just as valuable as their own. Care workers in Gaza are considered the society's moral compass. And I would go so far as to say that it is kind of the opposite in Western institutions. The second gap we hope to fill with our new project, Cultivating Courage, is that even for the healthcare workers and students who are invested in ending the genocide in Gaza, we are seeing folks compartmentalize their health and medical care work from their organizing and activism on Palestine. Some folks talk about doing it to protect their careers, while others are convinced that speaking up in a healthcare setting is not relevant to ending the genocide. And we reject both of these ideas, and I expect to hear a little bit more from the panelists about this. Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitta has changed the playing field when he gave healthcare workers the right language to connect our health systems to the targeting of health systems in Gaza. We have seen him talk extensively about what he has called the genocide enablement apparatus, which relies on global healthcare systems, particularly in the US and the UK, to silence healthcare workers outside of Gaza who are speaking out against the annihilation of Palestinians. Israel actually relies on Western medical institutions to punish, harass, and fire healthcare workers and students who push back on its death machine. This genocide is not just happening because Israeli soldiers are shooting the bullets and dropping the bombs. It is also happening because Western medical institutions are legitimizing it and in some cases have healthcare workers who are participating in it. In this way, our medical institutions have become an integral part of enabling genocide. This framework should make it very clear that our healthcare institutions are necessary sites for us to be disrupting with our speech and our actions. And the last point that I'll make, which will lead us to our first question, and I'll also stop blabbing so we can hear from our panelists, is that a lot of healthcare workers and students are afraid of the repression they will receive for their work on Palestine. I want to share my own personal story to make a point about what the lessons we can learn from our repression as healthcare workers and movement workers. I mentioned before that I'm an MD PhD student. I'm about 6 years into my training at Emory, and my medical school has not looked kindly upon my advocacy to end this genocide. I've been repeatedly targeted in the last year, and I want to clarify that the targeting of me has been a clear targeting of my existence as a Palestinian. Most recently, Emory School of Medicine has wrapped me up in a 6-month-long conduct case regarding an interview I did on Democracy Now! Back in April in 2024 about the Emory encampments and the violent police crackdown. Amy Goodman, who hosts Democracy Now!, must have read my letter that I sent to my medical school about its complicity in genocide, and she asked me about why I wrote it. So I wanted to give a very clear example of how our medical institutions enable genocide, and so I compared the cases of 2 Emory faculty. That of a Palestinian hematologist-oncologist, Dr. Abir Abu Yabis, who was unjustly terminated for her social media posts on Palestine. And as far as I know, she's actually one of the worst cases of repression we have seen in the US of a healthcare worker. And I compared her case with that of another physician who literally volunteered to serve in the genocide by joining the IDF in early 2024 and returned to teach medical students with no consequence. In that interview, I rightly say that this man aided and abetted in a genocide. And for speaking an internationally recognized truth and naming the complicity in genocide of my institution, I was suspended from medical school for a year, and I'll be put on probation for the remainder of my clinical training. What kind of care do we think an IDF soldier who believes in and upholds apartheid, illegal military occupation, and genocide might teach medical students? What kind of care might be provided to Black, Brown, and Indigenous patients by a physician who served in a military well documented to have committed crimes of genocide and apartheid. Rather than leaving my repression with a sense of fear, there are two lessons that I've gained from my repression and I hold on to. The first is very important, and that's the fact that there is a front of the genocide in Gaza that exists right here at home, and it is in our healthcare spaces. When IDF soldiers can return to their positions as providers after enabling the torture, rape, and abduction and slaughter of Palestinians, what kind of medicine gets practiced here? This is why it is necessary to resist in our healthcare spaces, because not only do they enable genocide, but they are a foundational and a critical part of normalizing it. And the second lesson about my case of repression that I take is that my repression does not humiliate me or disempower me. It strengthens me as a movement worker. I am one of many Palestinians in the diaspora who have been mobilizing frantically over the last 15 months to find out how to best target the institutions in the US who enable genocide. And I have found it. It is by naming with clarity and conviction the ways in which our medical institutions are not just complicit in this genocide, but are perpetuating it, are the ones committing it in some cases. And so my repression has actually exposed to me where the weak links in the Zionist genocidal machine are here in the US, and some of them are in healthcare. And rather than scare or silence me, my suspension has emboldened me that I have finally found a way to chop at the front of genocide as it exists here in the US. So enough from me. I'm going to pass this very important question on to our brilliant panelists. And so the question I have for all of you is, how did your repression as a healthcare worker actually improve your movement work? How did it make you stronger rather than weaken you or scare you? And so first up, we'll have Dr. Jabur speak.
Thank you, Maima. I think they picked the wrong person to mess with when they went after you. We're really proud of you. We're proud of your voice, and we're proud of your unwavering commitment to the truth, to the justice against the genocide. You are an example of how courage can be infectious, can be contagious. Your voice is enabling many of us to go down your path, and instead of being scared and intimidated, refuse to be intimidated, because it seems that when they try to silence us, they are fueling us to do more. And when they go after us, and when they try to smear us in any way or sanction us or punish us, in a way, they are liberating us to do more, and that the fear that they thought they will inflict on us will be a liberating force and mobilizing force for us to do more. Because courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is doing things despite fear. All of us have our fears. All of us have things to worry about. All of us have things to lose. We know that. But when your conviction to the truth, when you believe in what you do, when you believe in your humanity, when you believe in your profession and your moral obligation to stand up with the weak, with the victim, with the oppressed, when that conviction is strong enough, you do things despite your fear, and that is courage. And I think all of you here are courageous, and you all insisted on doing the right thing and speaking up despite your fears, despite the personal injury that you might suffer doing so, because your inner conviction, your moral compass is so strong to be bent or compromised by their threats and by their tactics. And I'm always guided by our colleagues in Gaza. And they are humans like us. They are not superheroes. They are not supernaturals. they have their fears, and their fears are 1,000 times worse than others, because our fears here is mostly about a job, about a position, about a status here and there. Their fears are literally about losing their lives, their families, their hospitals, their institutions, their people. And when Dr. Hammam al says, and if I go, who stays and treats my patients? If I go, who stays for my patients? I did not go to school for 14 years to abandon my patients. Conviction, his conviction to his profession, his moral obligation to be there for his people, for his patients, for the ones who need him, made him triumph over the fears, over the personal fears for himself, for his family. He could have chosen to leave Gaza. Most of our colleagues, Dr. Al-Bursh, who lost his life, he was invited many times to leave Gaza by his British medical institution that he used to work at and teach at. Dr. Hassan Mustafiya, he was, advised many times to leave. He has citizenship in another country. He's dual citizen. They offered him and his family to leave. And again, they are not superhumans. We should not paint the people of Gaza like superhumans. They can do things that we cannot do. They are like us. They care about their life. They care about their family, their children, their safety. But because their conviction of the truth, of their truth, their conviction of whatever they're doing is the right thing to do, that despite all your fears, you have no other option but to do it. This is our guy. None of us is enjoying this. None of us loves to lose their job or to be censored or to lose their life. But what other options do we have? To stay silent, not to do anything, and compromise our inner peace, our morality, our humanity, to allow this harm that's happening on those victims, the vulnerable people, the children, our colleagues, to abandon them, to leave them alone? Which one is more harmful? Should we take this personal risk no matter what it is? Although compared to our people in Gaza is nothing compared to what they're doing, what they're choosing to do despite all these risks. So I mean, here we are, in a way, we are very lucky. No one is murdering us yet, at least. The risks that we're taking are minimal, marginal compared to our people, the actual victims of the genocide there. And as people who are true to humanity, true to our profession, true to medicine, because medicine is not just a science. Medicine is a moral obligation. It's about protecting the sanctity of life. And if you compromise on this because you are scared from some sanctions, you are really compromising your own medical oath and your own integrity as a medical provider, as someone who went to school to protect the sanctity of life, to champion, to be the protector of the vulnerable, of the poor. And we are lucky that many of us chose not to compromise and insisted on speaking up despite all the obstacles. As you mentioned, Umayma, unfortunately, the majority did not, and they chose to be silent and to be complicit, especially our institutions. And as you mentioned, they are part of this, genocide enablement complex. The complex is the ones who are committing the genocide there with their weapons and bombs and the taxes and the money that we are sending them to accomplish this, and the ones here who are trying to silence the voices that are speaking up against this genocide. And we need to fight on both fronts. The only thing is, we should not make them win, because when they go after us, their goal is to break our soul. So we stop advocating and to distract us from our mission. Because when we speak up, we're speaking up to stop the genocide and to protect the victims there. If we get distracted with our personal issues, whatever they are, and stop the advocacy, they won. And if we stop speaking up, and if they break us, this will send waves of fear to all those who are around us. So even when they come against us, that should make us stronger because we need to be the role model. We need to inspire others that despite all of this, we're still focusing, we're not losing our focus from the main goal and the mission, which is to protect the victims, our children, the healthcare workers. And I'm going to stop at this point, but hopefully we can add more later on. Thank
Thank
you
you
for
so
giving us
much,
the
Doc.
opportunity, and I'm really honored to be with you all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jabur, and thank you for pointing us again to the healthcare workers of Gaza. That was an important perspective for us to have. Next up, I'm excited to hear from Dr. Qaadir.
Thank you so much. I actually want to echo something that Dr. Jabur said that is just resonating with me, and I just want us to sit with it for a moment. Medicine is not just a science. Medicine is a moral obligation. I feel like that sums up so much of what I feel and think and how I move in this space. And I want us all to hold on to that sentiment and that guidance. As a reminder, I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I work at Prairie Care Newport, which is, again, the largest provider of mental health services for children and families in Minnesota, in the Midwest, and arguably in the entire United States, second to the carceral system. And so you can imagine the immense responsibility that there is in that capacity to heal and care for so many children, so many families. In addition to clinical leadership roles that I have, I'm also the DEI clinical consultant. So what that means is I'm tasked with helping our clinical care specifically incorporate DEI principles. So this has to do directly with patient care. And I'm going to say a couple things about the experiences of repression that I've had, because they directly affect patient care. You know, we need to understand that any kind of censorship, banning of Palestinian health education training, all of this has direct implications today in this moment on patient care and patient safety. So this is a very urgent issue that we're bringing up today. I had been teaching for the last 3-4 years on colonial genocide in the context of chattel slavery, transgenerational trauma, post-traumatic slave syndrome, teaching about the complicity of medical institutions, specifically the psychiatric field, in reinforcing and being reinforced by chattel slavery as an institution. I had been teaching for years about colonial genocide in the context of targeting Indigenous children using boarding schools, right? I was teaching about reservations as a tool of enacting genocide, specifically through fragmentation and dispossession of Indigenous tribes. And so when I started talking about Palestine, it was an excruciatingly small pivot. And the retaliation that I experienced was from other doctors, other healthcare workers internally, and then also external organizations that placed defamatory pressure on the executive leaders in the hospital to remove the training that I was doing. And the training that I was doing was covering all these populations. And so in order to remove and erase Palestinian health education, Indigenous health education was removed, and Black communities' mental health education was removed. And so I think that's a really important concept to understand, that repression really reinforces this concept of it's all of us or none of us. And so 2 things I'll say. A big part of retaliation and attempted repression, for those of you who may be familiar, if you've experienced it yourself, is isolation, right? And that's a very core colonial tactic. It's part of fragmenting people, cutting people off from one another to weaken the community. So I was already plugged in and connected in multiple spaces of community and organizing. And so when I noticed the isolation, being cut off from opportunities to engage with my colleagues, people stopped communicating with me, wouldn't respond to messages or emails anymore. People that I had worked closely with no longer it's like I didn't exist. People were afraid of me, like I was something to avoid. So I think, again, that's a tactic to intimidate. But it didn't work on me because I was well connected in spaces of liberatory struggle. And so I recognized it for what it was, and I wasn't in it. I was outside of it. So the second thing I'll say is that because I had a grounding conceptually, because of my organizing work and leaning into Palestinian teachers, I understood that repression that I was experiencing was part of a bigger repressive system. And that is all about genocidal erasure. And so what I'll end with is saying that repression paves the way for genocide. And it has been going on. Our Palestinian colleagues in healthcare know this for years before now. They have been retaliated against and experiencing doxing and suspensions and demotions and all the like. We are experiencing an amplification of it in this moment because repression peaks at the annihilation phase of genocide. And so repression demands erasure. And this is why, as a healthcare worker, it is a moral obligation that we resist it, because it is literally about erasure. And so even if you think what you're experiencing might be slight or a small thing, if you understand the conceptual framing, you realize how important it is. And they would not do that if it didn't matter, which again, redoubles our efforts to resist it. And so I'll just say, because I was plugged in with the organizing spaces, I understood what I was in the middle of and I could orient myself. And that really has strengthened me to continue to actually, just like Omema is saying, be louder and do the work with even more fervence. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for concretizing how repression against even one healthcare worker impacts multiple communities and our ability to give ethical, just care to the communities who need it the most. That was really powerful. Thank you. Next, we would love to hear from Dr. Mate.
Thank you. And thank you to my colleagues who have spoken before me and will speak after me. I come from a somewhat different position because I have not faced repression for the simple reason they can't fire me because I don't have a job, So I'm in a rather fortunate situation that way. Now, I have been speaking about I retired from medical practice in 2011, and there's no position that I hold that can be threatened. So I'm rather free to say whatever I want to whomever I want, whenever I want. So I'm not in that same situation. When I was in medical practice, I did talk about, I visited the occupied territories. I was in Gaza, I was in the West Bank. I wrote about it in the newspapers. I spoke about it. I didn't face repression, and there's no grounds on which they can come after me. The only bit of repression I faced, I suppose, was in November of 2023, where I had an invitation from a major Canadian university to speak about issues that had nothing to do with Middle East, let alone politics. It was on strictly medical topics. But after I spoke about Gaza, that invitation was rescinded. I could live with that. So therefore, I'm not in a position to tell you guys what to do because you're under threat and I'm not. So therefore, I can only give you advice from the outside. So take it for what it's worth. If you're going to get engaged in a struggle, don't do it unless you're ready. Don't do it out in the sense of self-imposed should. Do it because you're called to it and you're ready to face the consequences. And nobody's going to blame you if you're not. If you're a young physician or healthcare worker and your livelihood is threatened, who would blame you for not getting involved? So I'm not saying don't get involved. I'm saying be ready for what's going to come down at you and have a realistic assessment of the situation. And if you're not ready, don't judge yourself. This is how it is for me. Do what you can quietly. It takes a lot of courage and security and support to do what colleagues of ours have done on this panel. So be realistic about what you're up for, number one. Number two, I would perhaps to some degree, dissent from Dr. Marya Mohammed's statement about this colleague. I would say don't personalize it. I actually think, and this may sound heretical or not welcome in this setting, and I would understand that, but that physician that came back from the IDF, I don't know if he's not capable of providing decent care. You know why I say that? Because people are perfectly capable of compartmentalizing. I know so many people that are decent on every issue except this one, because they're ideologically blind. They're split. And people who are good-hearted and even progressive on many issues, and this has been going on for decades, are completely incapable of putting together two rational thoughts or moral concepts when it comes to Palestine. I would say don't personally attack people, because there's a much larger goal, and I say that because there's a much larger goal here. There might be some kind of a ceasefire agreement in the next days. I don't know, but we're hearing noises in that direction. It's not just about the mass murder and the war crimes that have been committed and are being committed in Gaza. It's about the long-term Israeli occupation and the Zionist project of displacing the Palestinians. And whether or not there's a ceasefire, that project is not going to go away. So this issue is much longer than just the current tragedy and the current horror. And we need to raise consciousness about that. So a long-term goal is not just to stop the present horror, which of course we must do what we can, but also how do we advocate for understanding peace and justice in that land? And that's a long-term project that's going to long outlast the current terrible situation. And I wouldn't be too critical of people. I mean, I can be, and I have been, outraged and hostile. But if I'm grounded at all, I don't want to be too critical of people who don't see it my way, because people are propagandized. It's not even so much that they choose to ignore what has been called genocide by Israeli Holocaust experts. It's not that they're just ignoring it or choosing not to engage with it. They don't even know about it, because we live in a culture, in a media culture, that keeps people utterly ignorant and propagandized. So we need to have some degree of understanding for people that don't see it our way. And it takes a lot. Now, in early 1950s, in the States, there was McCarthyism. And Albert Einstein, who we all know who he was, who was actually somewhat sympathetic towards Zionism as a result of the Eastern European German anti-Semitism, but who also said in 1929 that if we don't know how to make peace with the Arabs, we haven't learned a thing in 2,000 years of our history. And he was very concerned with the displacement of the Palestinian population by Zionism. And he did not believe in a Jewish state. But he said in the 1950s about McCarthyism, I'm just going to quote his actual statement. He says, all the intellectuals in this country, down to the youngest student, have been completely intimidated. People are intimidated and they're kept ignorant. So the question is, how do we speak to people? How do we raise consciousness amongst people who ideologically are excluded from understanding, who don't have the information? It's not necessarily a moral failure on their part. Sometimes it is. But it could also be a matter of just lack of consciousness. So what I'm trying to say is a long-term goal here is, how do we raise consciousness? And I think the more clearly, because this is going to go on for a long time yet. The Zionist project, I'll finish by saying this, is not sustainable. I'm convinced, as a former Zionist and a Jew, I'm convinced that Zionism will be seen by history, by Jewish history, as a total disaster and a catastrophe. not just for the Palestinians, which it already has been and continues to be a nightmare, but for the Jewish people themselves. And so it's a long, so our, at least the way I perceive my job is, how do I raise consciousness? How do we all of us spread the light of truth on a very dark situation in the midst of a colonial system that punishes people who speak out and who denies reality? That's a long-term question. So I think we really have to prepare ourselves, and we have to be as grounded as we can, and speak as compassionately and as clearly as we can. Well, thanks for listening. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mate, for sharing. I especially liked where you shared about what it takes to be ready for this moment. And that's what Cultivating Courage project is actually about, is how do we prepare people to be ready for this moment and to meet the moment and the gravity of the situation. So thank you. Next, we'll have Dr. G speaking.
Thank you. I was reflecting on what it means to be ready, and because I remember when I first like returned to the United States from occupied Palestine and speaking to some friends. And I didn't really have the words to describe, beyond what we know as occupation and apartheid in the occupied territories. But I think I failed to, in the immediate time after returning, how to really put it into words to convey the gravity of what I was seeing. And one of my friends said, well, if you're not ready now, when will you ever be ready? And so I think there's something there about knowing that we're going to be imperfect in how we talk about horrible things in this world, like bearing witness to atrocities. There are certain things that we know to be true and to be wrong in this world. And that is a launching pad to be able to talk about things from a place of humanity and for justice. And to be able to commit to ongoing learning. And so I think back to October 7th, 2023. And similarly, with many folks in the audience, I think we all have a degree of self-censorship when it comes to Palestine, because we know the pervasive systemic impacts of anti-Palestinian racism and how this chilling effect leads to suspensions, leads to people being expelled, losing their jobs and whatnot. And so I was very cautious about what I put out there into the world, really resharing things from organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, or UNICEF, or the United Nations, or Amnesty International, and then also just sharing photos from my own travels from occupied Palestine, and also from the protests that I would attend here on unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory, also known as Ottawa, in Canada. And that itself was enough for me to face significant reprisal and repression from my workplace, from the University of Ottawa. And I was also on the board for the Canadian Medical Association at the time. This is the organization that represents physicians and medical learners nationally in Canada. And I didn't really have a choice as to how loud I was going to speak in solidarity for Palestinian human rights. The decision was essentially made for me, that to show any solidarity with Palestine and Palestinians, I was labeled things that was simply not true because of the pervasive impacts of anti-Palestinian racism. And so at that point, one has to make a decision, right? When in the face of reprisal, anti-Palestinian racism, what do you do? And I think when we talk about courage, when we talk about how do we deal with these things, these instances of reprisal, we know that the actions that we make, the words that we say, the ways in which we push through these instances of repression, not only have an impact on ourselves, surely it becomes a personal attack, but the actions that we have as individual, say, trees in a larger forest of a broader political, social movement, has impacts on that movement. And so the ways in which we figure out how to move forward absolutely have to do with how we support one another and lean on others for advice and mentorship as to the best path forward. But know that the impacts that we have as individuals in the face of these kinds of examples of reprisals has an impact on that larger movement. And so I kept thinking, and I still think about the ways in which how we all deal with these forms of anti-Palestinian racism is an opportunity to shed light on anti-Palestinian racism and on how frail the Zionist narrative truly is when confronted with itself, when it's confronted with a mirror to reflect on what Zionist settler colonial violence actually means to the Palestinian indigenous body and land and territory, which is overt genocide, because settler colonialism and genocide are one and the same by practice and by ideology. And I think about the ways in which I was supported by people so very quickly in the suppression and repression that I faced. And the people that supported me knew that the ways in which we get through these moments of repression is through community care, is through leaning on the things that we know to be true. And we also lean on our own sense of rooted identity. So like when I know who I am, the values and the principles that I stand for, it doesn't matter what people call me because I know who I am, and I know the people closest to me who know who I am will continue to support me and care about me because you know there's consistency in moral character and integrity when we carry ourselves forward when we face these things. It's not if, it is when, because when you are speaking and standing with people who are oppressed and colonized in this world, you are fighting against structural oppression, racism, colonialism, patriarchy, imperialism. And so you're bound to face repression. You're bound to face the heavy-handed tactics of institutional repression. So I think what I want to just convey is that it's not, in my situation, it was never about being ready. It's about, I think, knowing that the tools and the skills and the language is actually all around us, sometimes within us. And it takes sometimes an experience that actually, like repression, that allows us to grow into who we always were, leaning on the supports that we always had around us and pushing forward and actually using these opportunities of institutional repression to once again recenter the people of Gaza, recenter the people of Palestine, because anything that happens to us in the West, outside of occupied Palestine, is incomparable to the losses, to the risks that Palestinians and Palestinian healthcare workers, for example, face by the Zionist colonial project, because the things that they risk are truly incomparable to the things that we have to risk. So when we truly know that Palestinian lives matter from where we are, from Turtle Island to Palestine, then think about the ways in which our solidarity work and politics can be sharpened, that the risks that we take here can really escalate in solidarity with Palestinians when we have so much more that we can contribute through our solidarity work in dismantling these oppressive institutions in the West that facilitate and allow for the genocide to happen in Palestine through military funding, through academic and medical partnerships, through normalization of the Israeli Zionist colonial project. And so we are actually much more powerful than we think. We wouldn't be facing these kinds of forms of repression in the West if it weren't for people being afraid of how dangerous it is when people choose to speak up against the machinery of settler colonialism.
Thank you so much, Dr. G. I felt one of the points that stood out to me was the importance of solidarity. And I've always said to people that one person is alone, but two people in principled solidarity are an army. That is the power and the strength of standing behind each other. So thank you for sharing about your experiences of solidarity. That was beautiful. Next up, we have Dr. Marya.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for this beautiful panel. I am a professor of medicine on suspension from University of California, San Francisco, where I've been practicing I've been there for 22 years. I'm also a musician and a movement worker, a writer. And in these various identities, I feel like there's just a kind of like a bigger pillow to hold me. But like Asfia and others on here, I'm a movement worker, and I've been working in movements for social justice for as long as I've been awake. I'd probably say since I was 19 years old and went to the US-Mexico border when I was an undergrad at UC San Diego. And while my friends were out drinking in Tijuana, I was sitting there crying, seeing what I saw, just having a hard reality check about borders and settler colonialism. I grew up as a Punjabi woman to immigrant parents here in what is occupied Ohlone territory, where I am right now in the Bay Area. And my repression at UCSF really started in way back when I started to ask questions about why Black patients were not getting the same care as other folks. Why were these things happening? As I started asking these questions out loud, when my patient Charles Hill was shot by the BART police within 2 minutes of the police encountering him when he was in a mental health crisis and he was unhoused, I started asking these questions out loud. And as I got clearer in my voice and my articulation, the repression started happening, not only from my university, but the mayor's office and the attorneys, and it came from all sides. So it let me know that I was onto something. And I was onto something in my speaking that was related to what I was seeing in the hospital and seeing that inequitable care. And so for myself, as a person who comes from my own colonized history, as well as an anti-colonial resistance as a part of the Sikh ancestry, I hear Gabor, your comments, and I just wanted to respond a little bit because the asking to wait, to be patient, is hard for people who are being oppressed. It's hard for our Black patients who are not getting the care they deserve when 12 to 1 Black mothers die with poor care here in the United States, not just when they hit the hospital, but everything around being Black and female and having a baby or being pregnant is something that it's threatened. Life is threatened for Black children in the United States in utero. And so when I am with my colleagues at Standing Rock, when I was called out there by California Native folks to stand and take care of grandmothers who were being shot with rubber bullets in the face by Tiger Swan and other militarized police, the need to get safety, security, and health for those folks was actually quite urgent. And so a genocide to me is a code blue. And as a physician who works in hospital medicine, a code blue is a time where we act and we react in a critical manner. And that's what we're seeing here in Gaza. So although my repression and harassment started, in the 2010, 2011, it's been growing as I've started to articulate more clearly the the relationship between colonialism, capitalism, and health. That we are sick in our society for the same reasons that the earth is sick, what we're watching happening in Los Angeles right now, that we are sick because our duties of care for one another have been so severed that we no longer have a moral compass as physicians to say, actually, this insanity has to stop, that we can no longer accept the poor health outcomes for Black and Indigenous people here. We can no longer accept the substandard care for undocumented people. We can no longer accept the torture and abduction and wholesale destruction of the healthcare system in Gaza. And so when we get to that place of I can no longer accept this, this is a critical moment of activation of our voices, of ourselves, of our moral compass. And I agree with what you did say, Gabor, about you have to be ready for it, because what's going to come is the hammer. And when you are trained by movement family, as many of us here have been, and I find it interesting that those of us who have been targeted have all been people who've been trained in social movements. So you learn to understand that what's coming at you is a tool of in their repressive kit. Then you can start to understand the role it plays, and then you can understand how to work with it, how you can start ninjaing the repression, start moving back and pushing back so that you can have enough space to continue the work, as Dr. Jabur said, as Nadal said, about focusing on our advocacy for our colleagues and the people of Palestine. So when I got suspended, I was put under investigation when I started saying stop bombing hospitals. At this time, I was receiving death threats and rape threats and notifying my hospital that I'm getting these death threats and rape threats through my email for saying stop bombing hospitals in November of 2023. And there was no response. The first response was 10 days later when the administration contacted me and said I was under investigation for my speech online. And so it's been a wild ride for me as someone who has been advocating for and walking with marginalized communities in the Bay Area for decades, to then hear I'm suspended because I'm standing out and standing up against the normalization of genocide within the medical and the medical institution at UCSF. Now at UCSF we have a Dr. Howard Maybach, who's a proud sponsor of Friends of the IDF. He is someone who is a devout Zionist. He's represented by Alan Dershowitz as a lawyer. Howard Maybach injected 2,600 Black and brown imprisoned people with poisons paid for by Dow Chemicals and the various chemical companies to determine their pharmacokinetics in California prisons in the 60s and 70s as a faculty member at UCSF. Dr. Howard Maybach is not suspended, but I'm suspended because I'm standing up against this genocide, where the main funders of UCSF, the California State Senator Scott Wiener, who's also funded by the same funder, they want to see this genocide happen, and they want us all to shut up as it happens. So for me, as a person of color who's witnessing other people of color being annihilated, someone whose ancestors, and in my own lifetime, there was a genocide at the Golden Temple in India. So it becomes absolutely urgent to take this on, but it is not taken on lightly. And so when UCSF suspended me and then said I was a danger to patients and then threatened my medical license, there were a few days where I sat with that fear, and I just actually sat and meditated for a few days. And at this time, none of my colleagues were reaching out to me. I had become, like Asfia said, the pariah at UCSF. All these people who were organizing for Palestine, no one contacted me. I've been blacklisted in all the ways. I'm the harm. I'm the bad person because I spoke out in the ways that I did. But at this time, it was, a couple weeks into this, it was Dr. Hassan Abu Sitta, who texted me while he was being bombed in Beirut in the hospitals to be like, where's your support from your colleagues at UCSF? And I'm like, I don't even know what to tell you. And so to me, it was shocking that he said, well, because what's happening to you is tied to what's happening to me. And so to make those connections that, when I'm standing with you as a colleague who's being bombed, and I'm standing here to speak out in my professional and moral capacity as a human being who believes that all humans deserve life, and that I don't think we should lose that moral compass. So I don't think we should start demonizing anybody right now, honestly. I'm not of the camp that we go, oh, you're a monster, you're this, because once we start that language, we start the next cycle. Human beings have this horrific capacity to do this, what Israel is doing right now to Palestine over years. It's horrific, but it's happened before, and it will happen again. And so how do we walk people back into the sacred hoop of humanity to remember their humanity, right? So that for me is what's at the heart of my questioning. But when I told Abu Sitta, you know, hey, they're trying to take my license. They tried to hit his license. They tried to hit his license twice. And we were starting to make these connections. Okay, what's happening to you is happening to me. What's happening to Yipeng? What's happening to Umayma, right? So this is happening as a pattern. That's where we start to understand actually our repression. When you remove the voices of the professional moral class of people who are obligated to speak out against genocide because our job is to take care of life of all people, then you've removed the obstacle to the killing. So our voice is actually what's needed. Our courage and our voice is needed to speak up and to insist and insist and insist upon the dignity and the value of all life, and that any form of annihilation is unacceptable. As any form of colonial annihilation, we're past that. We're past that. The earth is crying out for us to get beyond this and to build a world of care. And so as I sat there and prayed for like 3 days, like, oh my God, they're going to take my license. I'm a single mom now. What am I going to do? How am I going to be a doctor? This is like what I do. I got to the point of not eliminating my fear, as Dr. Jabur said. The fear is still there. I got to the point of binding it. I could hold it and put it to the side. And that's what I said to Abu Sitta. I said, you know, I realized once I got past my fear, I could see the whole playing field on a different plane. I saw it very clearly, and I saw how we needed to move. And so I don't think it's, you know, I encourage young people to actually get involved, because this isn't just for Palestine. If you're looking at any of the things that happened when Luigi or whoever it is shot a CEO in broad daylight in Manhattan, and you saw the reaction from the people. Okay, I do not condone political killings like that. I do not condone what happened, but it spoke to the rage of people, of the injustice through the health system. There's so much rage because poor, Black, marginalized, Indigenous people have been denied the right to a healthy life for too long, not just here, but around the world. And so our job is to activate. Our job is to challenge these structures of power. Our job is to compost empire. Our job is to do it with dignity. Our job is to do it in a way that does not recreate the cycle for another hellscape to emerge. Our job is to lead with compassion and courage. And our job is to be those strong voices. Our job is to activate those voices, activate our care. And so this is where we see our work as tending to the social body. The social body is so sick. It is sick from 600 years of this settler colonial mentality. And Palestine has really brought all these pieces together. Because who would have ever thought a doctor standing up and saying, stop bombing hospitals would be a career-ending move? But for me, it really has been at UCSF. And that, to me, as I open that up, that allows me to see the structure of power that has insinuated itself into every level of medicine that doesn't allow medicine to live up to its potential as a force of love and a force of healing. And so that's why this repression for me has made me more committed than ever to building a world of care, and made me more grateful than ever for beautiful people like folks on this panel who have stood with me as we kind of hobble along and get stronger through these blows. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marya. That was a phenomenal answer. And lastly, for this question, we have Morgan.
Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be here and be speaking with you all today. I spent a lot of time actually trying to really understand and analyze how the tools that are used to repress Palestine solidarity activism are actually working before I came to encounter them myself personally in relation to my own advocacy. I remember becoming aware of what was taking place in the US when someone sent me a link to the national anti-Semitism hearings that were taking place in December of 2023 while I was living in Amman, Jordan, where I had lived for 5 years as part of my research as an MD PhD in medical anthropology working on refugee health. I hadn't been watching the US news, and I was supposed to go to dinner with a friend that night. But I was so shocked to kind of see what was happening and what was taking place in these hearings that I couldn't turn them off. So we kept watching on my phone in her car. And she was one of my friends who has family members who were killed in Gaza. And I remember sitting in her car watching the top officials in the US government debate about whether or not the use of the word intifada constituted a form of violence or not. And I don't remember if her relatives had already been killed at this point or if we were just worried that they might be, but Israel killed them. And they did it with bombs sent by the same politicians that we were watching debate about the meaning of a word from a language that none of them knew how to speak. And in that moment, I had this feeling of encountering something that was absolutely profoundly absurd, just this moment of make it make sense. Ever since that moment, I've tried to understand precisely how it is that the tools of repression come to function effectively and how they constitute a central component of this larger apparatus that Dr. Ghassan has described that enables the ongoing genocide to continue with impunity. One of the most prominent tools that's used to repress speech on Palestine is this discourse of professionalism that we've seen kind of stretched to encompass almost anything an institution wants to punish you for. You get a sense of the elasticity of the discourse when you look at the specific rulings that are used to formally discipline folks like Umayma who are talking too loudly about Palestine, especially when they start naming specific forms of institutional complicity. In a report that was published by Emory's own Office of Open Expression, which is publicly available online, you see that one of the initial ways that they tried to discipline Umayma was by calling her interview with Democracy Now! A violation of the American Medical Student Association's social media guidelines. We see how the original scope of this document is stretched dramatically in order to fit an interview with an internationally recognized media outlet within the realm of that can be governed and disciplined by a social media policy. We see how the rules begin to stretch, to take the shape of tools that can be used to silence and discipline students to protect the interests of the institutions that are wielding them. We see this sort of elasticity in all kinds of contexts related to the repression of activism and solidarity with Palestine across the US. This elasticity adds a deep, almost visceral sense that things are not working as they're supposed to, that our institutions do not stand for what they say they do, and that their rules do not protect who they say that they will. Of course, this is a truth that folks from marginalized communities have known for centuries. Today, we are in a moment when this truth has started to creep into a wider public consciousness in a way that lots of people have started to feel but don't quite know how to name. Ramzi Nimmer writes about how witnessing the first live stream genocide generates a sense of the absurd as we see the Israeli military enact horrific violence on a scale that is so massive as to be truly incomprehensible. This is what the genocide looks like in Gaza. What does it look like here? As we watch what Dr. Ghassan has called the genocide enablement apparatus operate here in the US, we feel it generating this parallel sense of absurdity. And I'm thinking right now about a scene from Washington University in St. Louis, where in the name of campus safety, police were sent to violently break up one of the Gaza solidarity encampments that was formed to protest the university's complicity in the genocide. In the specific scene that I'm thinking of, we see history professor Steve Tamari, a man who's in his 60s, as he's body slammed and violently beaten by cops who broke many of his ribs. And as they drag his body face down across the quad, we hear a student yelling out, "Don't hurt him." At Emory, we saw the chair of the philosophy department, a white woman who was violently arrested while she screams in indignation, "I am a professor." As MD PhDs in the social sciences, both Umayma and I have learned to connect that wounds that appear on the bodies of our patients to larger structures of violence. These structures continue to operate and enact violence in part because what connects these larger systems to their manifestations on the body remains invisible. Structures of violence operate by appearing as part of the background of everyday life, as just the way that things work. To the general American public, the egregious forms of violence that are continuously directed towards people of color in the US generally blend in to the background of daily life in a society that is structured by the logics and norms of white supremacy. In these moments, when we see violence directed in ways that do stand out against this background, these moments are worth thinking about, not out of any sort of reverence for the privileged social status of a professor, but because these moments shed light on the system of violence and how it's working, and they shed light from a different angle that allows us to understand how it operates in new ways. We see the same principles of elasticity operating in the disciplinary charges against Umayma as we do on college campuses. The state's definition of who represents a legitimate target for police violence stretches to include a white woman who is the chair of the philosophy department when she stands next to an encampment protesting the genocide taking place in Gaza. The Anti-Defamation League's statistics on anti-Semitic incidents stretch to include protests that are organized and led by Jewish folks who are standing in solidarity with Palestine. We start to feel this elasticity in a very visceral way, a stretching that pulls words away from what we all understood them to mean. This sense of the absurd that creeps into the public consciousness is part of what genocide feels like at the imperial core. For me, experiencing repression has shed light on the mechanisms, the specific mechanisms through which it operates, and being able to articulate their logics is a way of recognizing and naming a type of violence that is only able to continue because of its invisibility. So part of what we're trying to do with this Cultivating Courage curriculum and identifying the ways in which this violence operates is to name them and recognize them so that they stop being invisible. And I'm really proud to be a part of that larger project. Thank you so much for having me on this panel today.
Thank you, Morgan, for that phenomenal structural analysis. That was brilliantly articulated. Given that we have only about 5 minutes left on the panel, and I want to respect and be true to people's time and commitments, I think we're going to wrap up soon, but I wanted to invite any final comments from our panelists, if you could keep them very short, and I will provide a very brief conclusion to this panel.
Can I go, please?
Please.
Yeah, thank you, Maima, again. So, me as a Palestinian and a proud Palestinian, a proud human being and a proud doctor, I firmly believe that anti-Palestinian racism is the root of this genocide and the root of all the catastrophe that the Palestinian people have been going through for the last 120 years, being seen as brown people, Arabs, savages, sand, whatever. This justifies the genocide that has been happening for almost more than 100 years. And we know it very well that because we are Palestinian, because we are Arabs, because we are brown, our plight does not count as much, our lives do not count as much. And the genocide that was started in 1900 and 1948 was never recognized as genocide because we are Palestinians, because of anti-Palestinian racism. And we are growing more and more aware of this every day. But the last thing I expected is to experience anti-Palestinian racism here in this panel, which is something that I have to call out, that you have to wait, you can wait. There are great people, there are beautiful people. They only have this just minor blind spot, which is a genocide. Just a minor thing. It's okay, you can forgive them. They didn't know. As if this is not the first live stream genocide in history. As if there is anyone in the world who does not know. As if we still need to make up excuses for those who are complicit in this genocide. We refuse this framing, and no one has an excuse. During the Holocaust, the Nazis did not have an excuse, although at that time there was no social media and there was no live streaming of the genocide. And despite that, no one gave them an excuse, and they don't deserve the excuse. For anyone to come here in the 21st century, the first live stream genocide in history, to say these are great people, they just have this minor blind spot of not knowing or not, just small minor thing, which is just a genocide. So we need to forgive them because we are Palestinians, because our blood does not count as much. So I refuse this framing. And again, thank you for this panel.
Well, I have to say
Again,
here that,
and again, I want to add one more thing.
sorry, I have to say here that I'm very sorry if you heard me say things that I didn't say, didn't intend, don't think, and don't believe. Okay, I don't believe in waiting. I've been talking about this issue for 5 decades now. Number one. Number two, I didn't say it to excuse anything. What's happening is genocide, it's war crimes, it's criminality. I said that very clearly. I don't excuse any of that. And if you thought I said that, perhaps I didn't express this very clearly. I totally understand your outrage and your passion. I really get it. But I didn't say what you thought I said. At
It's
least,
not, it's not my
okay, number one, I was talking about that this is a long-term project, that this situation, this assault on Palestine is going to go on for a long time yet. It's not just about the current situation. Therefore, our task is to build consciousness over a long period of time. And I'm suggesting that we do so with some understanding of our audience. When I say audience, I don't mean Netanyahu and the criminals in the White House. I meant the ordinary people that we're talking to. And we have to understand their confusion. We have to understand their ignorance. We have to understand how propagandized they are and also how intimidated they are. So we have to address them, understanding who we're talking to and with what intention. I'll stop here because I don't want to get too emotional here, but for God's sakes, if the two of you, Rupa and you, Dr. Jabbar, thought that I said we should wait or have sympathy for the criminals, you didn't hear me, or I didn't express myself very clearly.
So thank you.
I honor everybody on this panel.
Thank you for explaining this. Thank you for explaining this. But you continue on the same path. You're talking about a long-term project. This is not a long-term project. This ends here. It's a genocide. All the perpetrators.
I know, but it's both.
It ends here. It's not a long-term struggle.
It's both.
Genocide. It should be considered as a genocide, and every perpetrator, every nation, every leader should be punished. And this will be the end of the project. It's not a long-term, oh, let this pass, and now let's plan something else, as if it's nothing happened.
No, I think I hear what's being said is we open this panel with this discussion of why don't we have more support? Like why are people so afraid to speak? Why, is it a moral question? Are they not engaged? Why are they not moving the way we need people to move to stop this immediate situation? So I think that Gabor, I hear that you were speaking to that. And Dr. Jabur Nadal, I absolutely 100% honor and recognize that the genocide is immediate, needs to stop right away. The long-term project of dismantling these structures is a big thing that we have to prepare ourselves for and gain the critical mass to do that work. So I hope that we can end with that, that we are all on the same team and that we have a ways to go. And I just have so much respect for everybody here. And our work is to right now stop the genocide immediately. And our work is to free Palestine. And in that work, we will learn how to do these other things together. And that is a long game. And we are committed to that game. So thank you. Umama, do you want to close us out?
I'd be happy to. Thank you for the final remarks. Just to close us out, I want to remind folks that Cultivating Courage is a project of Sened, a new organization that was created to be a solidarity network for doctors and healthcare workers. This webinar was meant to be a sneak peek into the skills that we will workshop together in the curriculum. The application for our first cohort is now open and live on our Instagram, and you can find it on the Instagram Sened account, or you can find it through the Doctors Against Genocide account as well. The first cohort will meet on Thursdays for 6 weeks from 8:30 to 10 p.m. EST, starting on February 13th, and will go until March 20th. Anyone who's a healthcare worker or student is eligible to apply, and we will be offering multiple cohorts throughout the year. So even if you don't catch this first cohort, please apply and follow our accounts to see when the next dates will be. I hope through this panel that folks were able to tap a little bit into their courage and their values today as we witness examples of what it looks like to be a healthcare worker or student who fights to end structures of violence, no matter what it costs them, particularly in the case of ending the genocide in Gaza. Just as Dr. Jabur started us, I want to leave us off remembering the physicians and healthcare workers in Gaza, of whom over 1,000 have been murdered by Israel and over 400 have been abducted. As the US and Israeli death machine continue to target these physicians, they still choose to care for each other. even when their own children are being slaughtered for it, even when their own lives will be taken. Although the time is bleak, I have absolute and complete conviction that the healthcare workers in Gaza are one of the guiding lights and examples of what it means to be a healthcare worker that will protect life, every life, no matter what it costs them. They are writing the future for what a collectively liberated healthcare can look like. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.